I've been watching a video on Netflix called Unorthodox. Watch the whole thing, it's fascinating. And at one point, so here's this young lady that has run away really escaped from the Orthodox Jewish community in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And she goes to Germany and falls in love with a symphony gang of kids. And so at one point the director is scolding the young people about that being part of a symphony is not a solo gig. There's no room for individuality here, that you subordinate your individualism to the harmony, the symphonic sound. And I'm thinking, well, boy, here's this young lady just left a group that enforced that kind of philosophy, and now this is what she wants to be part of. So there's, I think, the first thing to take a look at, the difference between the subordination of individuality in a culture versus a symphony. And so one difference is that they don't care if you leave the symphony. The whole thing about being part of the symphony is, are you good enough to belong? I mean, they'll kick you out if you're not good enough. They don't try very hard to keep you in. So there's no escaping from a symphony. The next thing that I began to think about was that this young lady turns out to be pregnant, and it then becomes a very, very high order of importance that they get her back, because they're trying to rebuild the 6 million Jews that were lost in the war. So this young lady having a baby, they've got to have that baby. It's got to, anyway. And these people are very exclusionary, very tightly knit. So here are the survivors of one of the worst racial purity purges in history, survivors of the worst purge in history, who now are engaged in their own very vigorous racial, cultural purity purging, not so much by throwing people out, certainly not by killing them, but by purging behaviors and thought. So then I get to thinking about that. I really will come to believe that the definition of culture is the set of norms that tells you who you are and who you are not, and then tells you what you're allowed to do based on who you are as a result of your birth. You don't get to change who you are, and therefore you don't get to change what's expected of you. And culture also tells you what you're not to do. Now, right about the time that I'm thinking about all this, I find this old picture of my son Damon at 17, and he's dressed up in a nightclub gown, this long, lovely blue gown, and he's got high heels, he's got a blonde wig. And so anyway, to me that then typifies Western culture. And I propose that Western culture is not a culture at all. It's an anti-culture. Culture tells you who you are and what you're allowed to do. And Western culture's primary value is there are no such norms, and there should not be such norms. Within Western culture, we have factions that are quite violent in their opposition to any sort of norms. Shouldn't be any norms. Okay, so then there's this complaint that Western culture is gobbling up, assimilating indigenous cultures, and indigenous cultures are going away in favor of the hegemony of Western culture. Well, that's not the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is that Western culture is like the nothing in Everlasting Story. Good movie, recommend it. So, here's everybody in Everlasting Story that's trying to fight the nothing. And that's what Western culture is. It's the nothing. And so indigenous people, young ones, are very attracted to an anti-culture that has no expectations of who they must be and what they must do and what they must not do. There's no such expectations. So then you run into the interesting problem of how does a culture such as the Orthodox Jews or the Mormons or fundamentalist Christians, how do they live inside their very rigid culture? They have strong culture and then live inside of an anti-culture. As a member of the anti-culture, I really don't like them. And I got a feeling you don't like them either. And the reason is that you celebrate the anti-culture. People who are aligned with the anti-culture find strong cultures repulsive. There you have it for today. Sure would love to hear back from you.